Well, hello and welcome everybody. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to CloudResearch's first conference focusing on online research methods. And I'd like to thank everyone who's attending and presenting and who has worked hard to make this conference happen. It's really wonderful and great to see everybody here. At CloudResearch, we're in a unique position to work with researchers in both academia and industry. And as a function of our role, we get to see many really great and interesting and innovative projects and people working on all kinds of different research. And we also know from experience that people in industry and academia do not necessarily have lots of opportunities to talk and network with each other. And that is part of why we were so excited to put this conference together. And we know that people in both academia and industry are doing interesting and innovative things. And we're really glad to bring together people to share that work and to make connections. And with that, it is really a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jesse Chandler. It's hard to imagine that just 10 years ago, virtually no one in academia was collecting online data. And a lot has happened in the last 10 years. And Jesse is one of the pioneers of online data collection. He published some of the very first papers on the use of Mechanical Turk. His paper on running experiments on Amazon Mechanical Turk, published back in 2010, was one of the first papers to describe the potential of the internet to transform social science research. I remember reading that particular paper back then and making notes on all kinds of ways that Mechanical Turk can be used and improved. And over the last 10 years, Jesse has made some fundamental contributions to our understanding of Mechanical Turk and online research more broadly, including work on data quality, replicability, non-naivete, providing some of the first estimates of the size of the Mechanical Turk population. Jesse also wrote important papers on using Mechanical Turk to study clinical populations and to conduct cognitive research. He's also written papers on expanding online data collection beyond Mechanical Turk. And today, Jesse will reflect on the past 15 years of research and on the ways in which Mechanical Turk did and maybe did not live up to its potential. And so without further delays from me, Jesse, over to you.
All right, thanks, Lee. And thanks everybody for showing up and joining me for this and us for this virtual conference. I'm just gonna share my screen here. Hopefully you can see it. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk today about the fulfilled and unfulfilled promises of Amazon Mechanical Turk. To be clear, as I was thinking about this talk, I realized that Amazon never really promised anything as a part of Mechanical Turk. So this is a mixture of like promises that the research community made to themselves, promises that the research community maybe thought that Amazon might have made to them, and so maybe promises isn't quite the right word. Maybe it's more expectations or something, but. What I'm hoping to do today is kind of take you through, first take you back to what things were like before Mechanical Turk, and then think a little bit about some of the ways that it's changed the field and changed online data collection and some of the work that still needs to be done. So without any further ado, life before MTurk was just different. I don't know if how many people who are attending this conference actually remember what it was like before online data collection was ubiquitous, but you basically had two options. So option number one is you would have to go out and find your own sample. Wasn't totally clear where you would look for research participants. There's often a lot of effort for very low yield. I remember when I was an undergraduate, one of my first jobs at Waterloo was wandering around with a clipboard trying to recruit senior citizens in a mall, because that was just the way you got people, right? Or at a hockey arena trying to get parents. If you did anything with online data collection, it was very hard to verify anything about people's identity. You just try and collect them for people from like Craigslist or wherever and try and get them into your survey. Maybe if you're part of a larger organization, you'd be able to stand up an entire group like a survey operations center to do this kind of work, but that would be very expensive, and it'd spend, unless you had a lot of data that you're collecting, it'd spend a lot of your time sitting around doing nothing. Quality was variable. Whatever you did wasn't really reproducible, right? Like the sample that you'd get from the hockey rink would be the sample you'd get, and someone at another university or somewhere else couldn't necessarily get the same people. And payment was always a hassle. I remember a very long conversation with the IRB at the University of Michigan about whether or not we needed to collect social security numbers from participants when we were giving them coupons for ice cream as in exchange for completing a survey, because there was a view that that was monetary compensation and that someone had to kind of manage that for, financial record keeping purposes. So, that was option one. Then option two is you could buy sample from a vendor. So there were, Mechanical Turk was by no means the first place you could buy sample online. There were lots of companies that were active in the space for, at least a decade before that, but the services were really expensive. Subject fees were opaque, but they were probably pretty low. And there was a ton of overhead, right? So you could buy sample, but that would come with like a project manager and some survey programmers and someone managing the sample and all sorts of extra bells and whistles that I think at the time, lots of people, particularly poor graduate students, didn't necessarily feel like they needed. The sample was often very inflexible. So a lot of these companies would have a minimum buy. You couldn't get someone to return your call unless you're willing to drop $10,000, $15,000, whatever. And there are often very strict restrictions on study length and design. So these firms had to consider both the needs of their client and the needs of their other client and manage their panel. So they do a lot of gatekeeping to make sure that you wouldn't do anything that would make their panel unhappy, make people fatigued, wreck it for other clients. And it was very hard to pilot and adjust too. So because of all of this inflexibility, you couldn't just, run a study, get some feedback about what's working, what's not working, kind of change stuff up on the fly and then refield. Just didn't have that kind of tempo. Any change you'd want to make, you'd have to have a meeting about it and talk to a programmer and so go through a lot of back and forth. And also purchasing was just a hassle. Everything was done through contracts. You had to work with a procurement officer through the university. It was just lots and lots of friction there. And I'm sure when MTurk showed up, it really changed all of this. So it by no means was the start of online data collection, but it was definitely the company that made it easy, right? And as we know, the company that makes it easy often gains a lot of market share and is the one that ultimately changes people's experiences, right? The patent for MTurk was filed a long time ago. It's a 20-year-old piece of technology. What's interesting about it is nowhere in the patent document does it talk about anything to do with surveys, right? So the innovation behind MTurk was originally that it was a platform that let people who needed work done get connected with people who are trying to do work. And the sort of use cases when it was first created had everything to do with filling in gaps in computation that machine learning and AI wasn't quite ready to do yet. So things like speech comparison, transcription, deduplication, using sort of fuzzy match principles, stuff like that. And that's, really what they thought the platform was for. There was never really an attempt in the beginning to make any sort of system that would accommodate people who were conducting human subjects research. However, kind of as a byproduct of this, they introduced a couple things that just solved existing problems that researchers have. So first of all, so the first accidental innovation is it provided a market, right? So it created a space where people who wanted to collect data and people willing to provide that data all kind of knew to congregate. So you didn't have to necessarily go out and figure out where your particular population was. Everybody just kind of knew where to be. And this alone made things extremely easy. The second innovation is that it provided a degree of security and confidence around this whole sort of awkwardness of exchange of time for money, right? So it offered an escrow service, so people who wanted to complete surveys had at least some minimal assurance that the money they would be paid existed and that this person collecting data wouldn't just up and vanish later on, right? And then on the requester side, it provided a payment management system that was simple and secure. So you didn't need to write checks for $5 to everybody who completed your survey and mail them out, right? You give one lump sum of payment to Amazon and they would take care of everything. And then also they would take record information about people's social security card numbers and credit cards and all of that and deal with all of the risk associated with managing that data, right? Which is a huge risk. You don't have to trust undergrads with envelopes full of cash or credit card, anything like that anymore. So that was a big change. And then the third innovation was it really tried to solve this issue of trust, which is a big problem on the internet, through the use of a reputation system. And this isn't something that's necessarily new. It's something that we've seen a lot of different firms apply to different markets. So if you think, for example, about how eBay made selling things online ubiquitous, it was largely through a reputation system. If you look at companies like Uber or Airbnb, again, their big innovation was helping strangers trust each other by creating this reputation system where you could gain information about other actors in the market based on what their prior interactions were like. And this made it far, far easier to be assured that the people that you were interacting with were likely to provide reasonably high quality responses, right? It's as compared to, say, some one-shot interaction with somebody that you recruit off Craigslist who you're never going to talk to again. It opened to the market, the public, in 2005. I believe Amazon was using this for a lot of in-house work prior to this. And actually, one of the first published research projects that you will find using Mechanical Turk data came out the following year by Aaron Coblin, and it's something called the sheet market. He was sort of thinking about how you can use Mechanical Turk to kind of learn something about people. And he said, I started looking at requests that involve personal life, such as what did you eat for lunch? The information seemed occasionally entertaining, but lacked any kind of insight beyond a simple internet survey. And so he decided to do something, a little more, I don't know, in his view as a designer, revealing about people. And he asked everybody to draw a leftward-facing sheet. Collected something like 10,000 responses, and this continues to live on the internet as an interesting artifact of the time and document of some of the potential of what a platform like MTurk could do. He went on to do some other really cool projects too, where he had made songs by having different individuals sing separate notes and kind of bundling them together to create a sort of average of that song. And then I think he has another project where he had people each draw small squares of a larger drawing that he assembled. So, really interesting, really playful stuff. And this was kind of the way, the sort of entry point for Mechanical Turk into academic research. And then if you look after that, you begin to see it getting picked up by researchers who are interested in things like natural language processing and artificial intelligence, who are taking the use case that Amazon designed it for and directly applying that to their own academic research. Very quickly after that, though, I think researchers realized that this can also tell us something about people. Like we can use this to collect data. And what you can see is that over time, interest in academic use of Mechanical Turk as a sample source has exploded. So this is a somewhat old graph, but the trajectory continues more or less the same if you look at Google Scholar searches or other methods of indexing the popularity of MTurk. And what I'm showing you on this graph here is just the number of papers published in high impact journals. So these are journals that have an average citation impact factor higher than 2.5. And you can see that by 2015, it's, there's something like, 500 papers in these tier 1 journals that are using MTurk as a sample. I think one of the other interesting things that sometimes gets overlooked in this graph is just the very long incubation period between when the platform became available and when it really started to take off, right? So you get a couple publications in 2017, none in 2007 rather, none in 2008. And then it just took a while. And I think part of that was that back then there was deep, deep skepticism about this platform. People were wondering, like, well, who would actually ever complete a survey for 10 cents an hour or whatever it was people were paying them back then? Not a lot. Again, they're anonymous, and reviewers don't know who the sample is. Yet at the same time, in some ways, they're just as anonymous as people you recruited from a hockey rink down the road from a university that the reviewer's never been to. But for some reason, this population just felt like less knowable, right? It felt weirder. These are absolute numbers here too. They're not percentages. But if you look at the other way to kind of think about the penetration of MTurk is just to think about the percentage of papers that rely on MTurk as a source of sample data. And those numbers are really high. Again, these figures are very dated. They're 5 years old now, but they're illustrative, and it certainly hasn't changed. But in 2015, if you look at some of the top journals in social psych, about a third of the samples come from Mechanical Turk. That's a lot, right? The sort of historic split before this was like 90% college subject pools, 10% other weird stuff. And then, gradually, MTurk has kind of eaten into the share of samples that would ordinarily be college students recruited from their classrooms. Similarly, in consumer psych, about 40% of samples in their top tier journal come from Mechanical Turk. And then even in clinical psych, this is focusing specifically on personality disorders, which is a subtype of clinical science, but about a quarter of samples within their top tier journals also use Mechanical Turk. So, this is like really big penetration if you consider that this is not just a type of research being online research, but one specific platform offering that service, right? So kind of wild, and hard to overstate the kind of impact this ended up having as a platform. And it did so because of a number of different promises, right? So promise number one, I think the thing that everybody immediately saw in the beginning was that this would give us a much more diverse sample than what we were working with in typical university research. This is kind of how sampling works, right? Like you're interested in the world, and then some proportion of those people self-select into college, and then some proportion of people after that self-select into your subject pool, and then that's kind of who you get and who you get to study in order to make more general inferences about the world. And certainly with MTurk, there's a sense that this gave you access to more people, right? So you would definitely be constrained to only those individuals who had access to the internet. But I think even then there was the sense that, internet penetration would go up, and that would eventually become less of a problem than you might otherwise think. And today, I think most researchers wouldn't even consider the kind of coverage problems you'd have with people not having access to the internet as something that was particularly relevant, unless you're looking at very specific populations, developing world prisoners, things like that. And then, again, you have this sort of selection issue of, well, who's selecting into Mechanical Turk from the internet? But that's at least no worse than the selection problem of who's selecting into your sort of undergraduate subject pool and taking your class. The other thing I'll say about this, though, is there was a lot of mystery around, well, who is selecting into this pool, right? Like, who are these people? And as a result, I'd argue it's made the MTurk sample probably one of the most well-described online populations that you can find. So there are dozens, if not hundreds of papers that are trying to describe this sample in a way that you don't really see for any other sample. And I think the upshot of all of those papers is that it's, obviously more diverse than college or community samples, but it's still mostly college students, right? It's a very online population, so they're young. They tend to be very educated. They tend to be very liberal. And partially maybe as a result of their age and level of education, they're more atheist, tend to have higher proportions of people who identify as LGBT. These are all things that kind of correlate together in the real world, and so those differences maybe aren't that surprising. And they do tend to be whiter too, which you sometimes see with internet samples as a whole. So I think we ended up with a more diverse sample. In some senses that promise was kind of fulfilled, but it's still definitely not a sample that reflects, America or North America. It differs in some pretty important ways. One of the kind of happy bonuses that came along with this whole process, though, was pre-screening features were developed. So this is something that CloudResearch has done, also something that Amazon's experimented with, and it was really, I think firms realized that there was lots of interest in understanding this population, and then also trying to do something to make these populations a little more diverse or a little more flexible. And as a result, we've actually seen some tools become developed that are designed to make this platform specifically useful for researchers interested in human subjects research. So, that was never a promise. It was more like a bonus gift that kind of fell on everybody's lap, but, glad to have it. And kind of where we are now with all of this is that there's some work trying to explore using weighting and various other techniques to address some of the sample limitations and, make the sample yet more representative of the population as a whole. We may see some more discussion of this later today. I think there's a session on polling. But I would say that, overall, both within MTurk and online samples as a whole, this is something that's still very much in the early phases, and there's still a ton of work that needs to be done on thinking about these issues. That said, there's also lots of other differences to be unpacked. A lot of the discussion about what MTurk workers look like, or people who complete online surveys look like, has really focused on demographics, because those are things that we have high quality information from the population as a whole about. I can look at the racial composition of an online sample, and I can tell you how it differs or doesn't differ from, say, the United States or whatever other comparison that I have. But there's lots of other differences. And so there are a handful, but a growing number of studies that kind of paint this picture of people in MTurk in particular, and maybe online panels in general, as having sort of distinct psychological characteristics that make them a little bit different from the population as a whole. We know that they tend to be more conscientious than the average person. We know that they tend to be more socially anxious, and they also tend to score higher on some sort of autism spectrum disorder kind of characteristics. So a little bit of narrowness and rigidity, emotional dysregulation to a very small non-clinical extent, stuff like that. And we don't really know why that's the case. There's a lot of different explanations. Could be a cohort effect. So some of these differences you just see between younger and older people, and we know the MTurk sample is very young. It could be an artifact of data quality. So, as I'll get to later, all of these measures are self-report. So whenever you have self-report, you have to worry that the reports are accurate. Unclear to what extent the elevated levels on some of these characteristics might just be people kind of circling the wrong number on a scale. But it's also exactly what you might expect if you have an online labor market where where people spend time in lieu of being out in the world, kind of interacting with people face to face, and where your ability to succeed or not depends on this reputation, this sort of reputation system that requires that you do consistently high quality work on these very monotonous tasks in order to, remain a part of the platform, right? We don't know a lot of this because there actually hasn't been a lot of work about the process of finding and deciding to join or leave MTurk. So, there's been some qualitative interviews with Mechanical Turk workers, but I still, after all of this time, don't have a really good sense of, how people find this platform. Like, do they read about it in the Washington Post and sign up? Do their friends tell them about it? How do they get there? And, what really makes them decide to stay? And it's also, these characteristics are a little bit troubling because there aren't usually national norms for a lot of them. The number of potentially relevant characteristics is approaching infinite, and it's not, and because there aren't national norms, it's just not clear to me how you would ever adjust for these, right? Which to make an MTurk sample really representative of the population as a whole. And so I think what that means is you have to have, really think carefully about the research questions that you have and the extent to which these kinds of differences might impact the work that you're trying to do. And it's a murky space because there aren't necessarily great answers all the time, right? Like you really just need to kind of fumble through and think about the appropriateness of this platform for the work that you're doing. Also importantly, we've learned that results can vary across subgroups. So for example, if you look very narrowly at older MTurk workers in particular, first of all, we know that they're very hard to find on the platform. Like as it turns out, older people are less technologically savvy. They're less extremely online, so they're less likely to kind of show up in communities like MTurk. And because of those really strong selection pressures, older MTurk workers look very different from their sort of non-MTurk peers. They score much higher on verbal fluency and verbal analogy tests, which you can think of as a measure of cognitive ability. They report much better memory and health in terms of self-report. They tend to follow the news more closely. They're less partisan. And these are big differences, right? So, and then in comparison, when you look at younger adults that you'd find on MTurk or other samples like that tend to look much closer to the population as a whole because there isn't really that same selection process pressure that's forcing a specific subgroup to adopt the platform. And so what this means is all of that sort of high-level descriptive work that I've told you about, looking at populations as a whole, comparing MTurk to everybody in the United States, all of that's great, but then if your research interests happen to be in specific subpopulations, it's not necessarily true that any of those findings will apply to the group that you're interested in, right? Really, there has to be sort of some foundational work as a part of your research to kind of figure out who your specific subgroup is like and the extent to which they map onto people in the population as a whole. This applies regardless of whether you're interested in older workers, cancer survivors, people with gambling problems, like any of that, right? Because there's, just as a smaller subgroup, there's more opportunities for selection pressures to rear their head. Promise number 2 is access to larger samples. right? So when MTurk first launched, you sort of go to their landing page, and it's like, advertised like 500,000 workers or some crazy number like that, impossibly large, and it's very seductive, right? As a researcher in an academic institution, prior to this, you'd typically get like a subject pool allocation. You get your like 100 subjects a semester, and that's kind of what you had to work with, and very narrow windows when these people were available. MTurk definitely changed all that, and it's evidently true that there's access to larger samples, but they're just not as large as most people think. To this day, I still review papers that say that MTurk has 500,000 users. I mean, it's the first thing I check for when I review papers. And it really misses this distinction online that not all registered users are active, right? Lots of people join Mechanical Turk and then they quit, still counted as a registered user, or maybe they're only on intermittently. And so the pool is actually a lot smaller than that. And then not all active workers are accessible too. So requesters often place selection criteria on who they want out of the pool, and they do that to improve the quality of their sample without necessarily thinking through some of the consequences for how that limits the sample that they have available from that larger group into a subset. However, beyond that, we also know that workers tend to seek out and avoid specific requesters and types of work. As I mentioned before, there's a reputation system on MTurk to help people trust each other. It turns out that that's not particularly symmetrical. So if you're a worker, you have a reputation and requesters can filter you. If you're a requester looking for researchers or other, if you're a worker looking for researchers or other requesters, you don't have a really good sense of whether someone's going to pay you, whether the tasks are reasonable, anything like that. So workers tend to actually find stables of people that they know that they can trust and do their work preferentially. And we also know that there's a small subset of workers online who just are always online and do everything they can possibly do. And that tends to crowd out less experienced workers. And so there's a number of papers that have kind of looked at these issues in various ways. And the conclusion from all of these is that the pool is, at any given time is probably an order of magnitude smaller than 500,000. And then if you're looking at the kinds of workers that researchers are actually accessing when they're engaging in the kinds of recruitment strategies that they're engaging in, each individual researcher is probably accessing a much smaller pool, maybe 10,000 workers, something like that, for a combination of all of these reasons. And so that's still a large sample, right? 10,000 people is a ton of people. That's great. However, if you're interested in a subgroup of people as a whole, that number is yet smaller. And then also, if you're conducting multiple studies over time, you can very quickly burn through that pool. It will replace itself over time, but maybe not as quickly as you might otherwise hope. That kind of brings me to my other issue. There's this idea of panel conditioning, which is that, it's an idea that's been around for a long time in survey research. And just the idea is that like participating in surveys changes participants over time. And this is a lesson I think that a lot of us who use Mechanical Turk kind of had to learn the hard way. I say the hard way in the sense that people kind of knew this was an issue before MTurk was developed. However, as I'll get to later, MTurk's really pushed forward research on panel conditioning at the same time by helping people understand the extent to which it can apply to their research and affect their research. This is an illustration of a sequence of effect sizes from a sequence of studies published by Dave Rand back in 2014. This particular set of studies looked at cooperation rates under time pressure versus when there's a time delay. And so the idea behind these papers, these studies, was basically that cooperation is not a default behavior for people. You need to have sort of cognitive resources to think through whether you should cooperate, how you should cooperate, and then engage in that behavior. And so when you place people under time pressure, cooperation rates are, I have this backwards. When you place people under time pressure, cooperation rates go up. And you have to actually think through the why you shouldn't cooperate. And the upshot of this paper, though, is they noticed that as they've collected study after study after study, these effect sizes went down. And basically what you're seeing with this line here is that the effect of time pressure is going away as time goes on. And the explanation for that is that time pressure only works for tasks that you've never done before. If you've completed a task multiple times and you kind of know how it works, time pressure isn't going to have the same kind of effect on you because the response that you engage in is kind of automatic, right? Since then, there's been a whole sequence of papers on different ways that experience within a panel can affect how people make decisions and engage in survey behavior. And we've learned a lot. We've learned that practice effect can impact measures of ability. So if you're doing anything related to cognitive performance, measures of cognitive performance improve with practice. And if you're taking a lot of surveys that are measuring cognitive performance, your score will go up over time. We've learned that participants learn how to falsely gain access to studies. So if I run studies with specific screening criteria again and again and again, and each time you indicate that you have a certain set of demographic characteristics and you get kicked out of the survey and not paid, sooner or later you learn that you're just supposed to say that you have that characteristic to gain access to the study. We've learned that effect sizes decline with repeated exposure to experimental stimuli, even for experiments where people don't necessarily have an obvious learning component to it. So it may be that being exposed to different experimental treatments within the same experimental design kind of contaminates the pool in some way that produces smaller effect sizes. And we also see that participants develop preferences for certain kinds of studies. They begin to learn that like certain researchers or certain tasks are, kind of hard and difficult to do or maybe unpleasant, and they'll avoid them or drop out of them as soon as they figure out what's going on. And we even see other bad behaviors. So, there is some evidence that participants, particularly the most experienced among them, develop time-saving strategies like copy-pasting text responses to open-ended questions to make sure that they don't have to write the same thing again and again and again. And I think this is illustrated with, so these kinds of open-ended prompts are used a lot by researchers to induce mind state. So, maybe you ask someone to think about a time that they failed because you want to make them feel bad, and then ask them to write a paragraph about that failure experience. Well, there's a certain point where you do that 3 or 4 times. Maybe you just save it as a text document and, click paste the next time you see a study like that. Of course, that won't induce the sort of sense of mind, the sort of mindset of failure in people who do that, and that's a problem. So, this is something that that researchers have definitely been able to develop workarounds to. We can talk about that later. There's lots of features that are baked into CloudResearch that address this. But this was definitely, a lesson that we had to learn that wasn't necessarily obvious to anyone at the beginning. Promise number 3 was that there'd be that the common pool would lead to reproducible sampling. So, when MTurk, one of the sort of trends that happened within academic research that really paralleled the uptake of Mechanical Turk and in many ways is kind of blended with it was this idea of the reproducibility crisis. So the past, in the past years, people have been really worried about whether or not findings replicate. And prior to MTurk, whenever you tried to run a study and you couldn't replicate it, there was always this concern about maybe your sample's just different, right? So someone at Yale would publish a finding and there'd be a significant result, and you're at some liberal arts college in rural Idaho and you can't replicate it. You don't know, like maybe your students are just different in some unquantifiable way, right? There's a lot of ambiguity there, and it's a fundamentally unsolvable ambiguity because you can't go to Yale and collect the data, so you don't know, right? You just have to live with that and either persevere thinking that's not the case or give up on that line of research. With MTurk, particularly when nearly every paper has an MTurk sample in it, you have a study that you can go and you can try and directly replicate to calibrate what you're seeing to what somebody else has reported in the past. And then if you want to build on that or, and extend that line of research, you can do it in a way where you're reasonably confident that the effects would replicate. And that's true in theory, but I think in practice, this is one of those promises that we've kind of made to ourselves and broke. If you look at the MTurk literature and how people report studies, there's just a real lack of norms around describing even really basic hit characteristics. So I see papers all the time and they don't describe, what criteria they use to select workers, whether they kicked any workers out as a result of failing data quality checks, what the text that they used to recruit those workers were, how did they describe the study. All of that stuff's missing and there's no real standard that people adopt, which makes it really hard to replicate. One of the things I've started doing in reports that I write is I've just taken a screenshot of the hit as it was posted. So anybody who wants to go and replicate it can just do it. They can copy it exactly and it's there, but that's not something that we've seen a lot of in the field. We've also learned that there's lots of variation in sample composition. So this process of moving from MTurk to your study is something that has lots of selection pressures in it. We know that, for example, posting in different times of day will change the composition of the sample. That's true both within a time zone, because you sort of get larks versus night owls, people who are really kind of alert in the morning versus stay up late. I think Lieb's done some work on that. The time of day finding I'm referring to here has to do more with time zones though. So, if you're posting at 9 a.m., you're not getting people from the West Coast. Unless they're sort of coming out to the first session this morning to present, they're probably still in bed. You also get differences with sample size. So as sample size goes up, the composition changes because people who respond early are different from those who respond late. You get these big history effects. So, things happen in the world and your panel composition changes dramatically. Saw a little bit of this with COVID, so in some ways maybe. But I think probably the more salient and in some ways kind of frightening example was just this week with Prolific, which is another online panel provider, and they had this giant influx of basically Generation Z women after they went viral on TikTok. Those kinds of things can happen and you're not necessarily even aware that they're happening. It's all just going on in the background. And again, task description seems to matter a lot too. So if you look across studies, you get really, really big differences in the sample composition just based on how the study is framed, right? So men and women are interested in different things. They gravitate towards different studies. People who like politics probably selected the politics studies, and so on and so forth. And so for that reason, it actually even kind of makes it unclear, aside from the basic hit characteristics that you specify, what task features you even need to report to ensure reproducibility. That's just really tricky, and I don't think that that's totally solved. So, I think the big lesson from all of this is that it's hard going it alone. So, in the beginning when MTurk came along, I think that there's a sense of, excitement about disrupting the survey research industry. Like we can go it alone. We don't need sampling statisticians. We don't need any of this expertise. We can totally cut out the middleman and get direct access to sampling. That's great. And that's not totally true, right? Like one of the consequences of this is we had to kind of go and redevelop and rediscover lots of bench wisdom that I think a lot of panels just kind of knew and didn't really talk about, because a lot of this work happened within the black box of panel maintenance, right? Because where stuff just kind of happened in-house and it wasn't necessarily talked about in the same way that it has been since the advent of mechanical. Promise 4, and this is a big promise, is high quality data. I'm just going to give a very brief tour through this, but I think in the beginning, everybody was very excited by the quality offered by responses in Mechanical Turk. The reputation system seemed like a really good solution to data quality problems. And in general, if you look at the early studies, there's just a lot of work that was invested in showing that effect sizes were at least as good as those provided by other research participants, who, in hindsight, maybe also aren't providing perfectly high quality data, but I think people always assumed that they did. So one big lesson we've learned is that experimental effects conducted on platforms like MTurk usually replicate and look pretty close to what you see in representative samples. So this is work by Alex Kopic, and there's another paper by Lapierre and Druckmann that does something similar. And basically in these papers, what they do is they look at experiments conducted using tests, which is a high quality nationally representative sample. It's extremely expensive, very rigorous, very thorough, and looks at the effect sizes that are obtained for exact replications of those studies fielded on MTurk. And the upshot of this is that if you look at all of those effect sizes from all of those studies and you kind of correlate them with each other, the correlation is something like 0.85. And so what that tells you is that in a sample like MTurk, big effects that you see that are big are likely to be big in the real world, although you don't know precisely how big. Effects that are small are likely to be small, and effects that don't exist are likely to not be true. And so, there is a fair amount of imprecision here, but if at least you're trying to understand, like directionally, like do people feel more or less sad after this experimental treatment, you're going to get some pretty good information about that. And really that's, for large segments of academic research, that's really what researchers care about, just the direction. We're not really at the point where the precision of effect size estimates is critical to advancing the field. I think people would disagree with how critical it is, but certainly the field's not typically concerned with doing that. Correlations also look okay too. So there's a couple papers that just look at individual differences amongst people and correlate them within each other to see if the patterns look the same within MTurk in higher quality, sort of more expensive, more representative and rigorous samples. And generally the answer is yes. So what I'm showing you here are predictor and criterion variables that Scott Clifford looked at. So he was interested in the association between various personality traits and various political beliefs. And in their paper, they found that something like 32 of the 36 examined relationships were effectively the same. Snowberg and Yarov have a similar finding in a more recent paper. And I think, again, the conclusion is that, patterns and relationships and associations that you're seeing on MTurk are generally, historically, have been probably pretty close to what you'd see in the population. However, this kind of changed a couple years ago. So, a few years ago, people got really worried about bots. There was this big bot crisis of 2018. Lots of concern. There's this observation that data quality on MTurk had declined precipitously. There was also an observation that the low quality data tended to have these very predictable patterns, which is, so sort of low effort, all caps responses to open text boxes and sort of picking higher numbers on scales and stuff like that. And there was lots of concern that maybe someone had built a robot that was pretending to be people on MTurk, and the people on MTurk in a lot of ways are pretending to be robots and feeding into the human computation system. Very meta, very weird. Turns out they're not robots. They're probably just people, and they're probably people who don't speak English particularly well, which is why they have low quality responses. There's been a bunch of papers kind of exploring this issue, but I think the take home, there's two take homes from this. One is I think it revealed a certain element of underlying paranoia about artificial intelligence in the academic research community. It was like a big applied experiment in illusory correlations and pattern finding in the whole process of trying to detect what was going on here. But also it revealed that the reputation system itself had some problems with it, and whatever the cause of the data quality problems were, that wasn't necessarily working. Not all was well, and things weren't working the way that they should. It's not very surprising that the reputation system is broken. I think we actually warned about this in our first paper back in 2010 that this was going to be a problem, but the reputation system only works if people requesting people to do work actually enforce quality standards and reject people who submit poor quality data. And there's lots of reasons not to do that. Reviewing and rejecting responses is very time consuming. It causes arguments with people. You reject their work and they get really mad because it has consequences. And you can even say that it might be unethical from an IRB perspective to reject payment to someone on the basis of their responses. That said, if they have a US Social Security number that's stolen and they're fraudulently completing the survey from somewhere else and they're kind of a criminal, it's unclear if rejecting payment to them is totally unethical, but that's, it's a debate that I think a lot of people have wanted to steer clear of. As a result, the high approval systems ratings don't really differentiate workers anymore, and this is what makes the reputation system not work particularly well. And it also makes workers even madder about rejections when they are rejected, because everybody has a 99.99% acceptance rate. And so rejection is not a common experience. It's, in fact, a rare and devastating one. And this arguably creates a less ethical system in some ways, because there's, this has impacts for other people trying to get work done, and it leads to all sorts of less transparent ways of managing sample that we'll kind of come to in a minute. We also learned that data quality is very high stakes. So prior to this, at least the way I thought of data quality was that poor quality data leads to null results. Null results don't get published. You waste a bunch of time and money, and that's kind of it. It affects you, but it doesn't really affect anybody else. But more recently, I've kind of become concerned that poor quality data actually causes false positive findings, and they make their way into the literature very insidiously, and then they become not just your problem, but they become everybody's problem. So this is something that I don't want to say excited about, but maybe interested in now. What I'm showing you here is a correlation between social anxiety and Facebook use that we observed in a study. It's like 0.32, seems kind of plausible, right? People who are socially anxious spend a lot of time on Facebook. Maybe you even want to tell a story about how Facebook makes you feel anxious. That would probably get published somewhere. But as it turns out, if you apply a data quality measure where you're looking at the rate at which people are endorsing or failing data quality checks where they're endorsing very implausible questions, you can break out responses by those who pass those kinds of data checks and who are answering questions plausibly, and people who are answering those questions implausibly. And what I mean by implausible questions are things like, I enjoy waiting at the Department of Motor Vehicles to renew my license, like something that no one would ever suggest. And so when you break the sample out this way, what you see is that the low quality respondents are really driving this correlation, and there really is no relationship amongst the high quality respondents. And what you're seeing is just an artifact of data quality. It's a false positive association. You can get play similar games, and the effects actually are, the rarer the behaviors, the more extreme the effects get. So what I'm showing you here is, in a similar study, the correlation between self-reported hallucinations and violent behavior looks like a very strong correlation, right? And as it turns out, that is entirely driven by people providing low quality responses. Again, something that you could imagine somebody plausibly trying to publish that's just not true. Let's skip this slide. I think the upshot is that this has generated a lot of attention about data quality measures. There's been a ton of work. And we don't, that's interesting, but it hasn't, I think it's a very immature field in a lot of senses. A lot of these data quality measures are just kind of invented, and the psychometric properties aren't really investigated very carefully. And it's difficult to justify putting much work into them because they only last for a little while, and then everybody learns them and kind of, works around them. There are some technical solutions too. So if you've been following what's been happening in terms of developments, at any platform site, but particularly CloudResearch, people find workarounds. So, you start identifying IP addresses that bad workers come from, and you block them. Of course, they can find new IP addresses to come from and kind of work around that. You can start doing things like adding language checks or other services to validate workers, and that kind of works, but maybe it won't last forever. You can start doing things like digital fingerprinting, but that's its own arms race because browsers and other stakeholders have very strong motivations to obscure digital fingerprints for their users. And so these solutions are all kind of temporary and often opaque and are useful and necessary, but we don't have this sort of ideal world where we're going to have a high quality sample that remains high quality without any sort of vigilance on the part of anybody involved in using it. And I'm just going to do a very quick tour through some unexpected positive consequences. I'm going to be brief about this because, as it turns out, I was looking at the program today, and a lot of these unexpected positive consequences are really just realized through other people's presentations and the work that they're doing. And so, it's really not, for me, I think, to talk about them too much. One is that competitive pressures really changed the market. It's like much easier with every vendor that you deal with now to get sample. Cost is lower, people are more flexible, and it's because I think everybody's kind of has had to adjust to this reality. And maybe it's not MTurk, maybe it's technology as a whole, but this is just getting easier to do, right? And that's great. I think that's better for everybody ultimately. There's also just undeniably more discussion about research methods, right? So a lot of these problems that researchers sort of confronted collecting data that they thought were individual or that were often hidden and have become visible and collective, and it's created an opportunity for people to talk about them and to find solutions together. And I think that's great too. This includes topics like, do individual differences and hidden moderators matter for the replicability of experiments? Answer is probably not, or not usually. Is selective attrition a problem? Answer is sometimes. Does naivete matter? Again, the answer is sometimes, but I don't think we have a totally great handle on when. And is fraud a problem? And if so, how do we deal with it? And it's great that we're talking about all of this stuff with regard to data quality. And we've also learned that platforms are people and people cause the problems. Like MTurk promised to solve a lot of things that were fundamentally caused by research participants being people. The solutions were temporary. I don't think any platform that comes after MTurk will be invulnerable to the kinds of problems that we've struggled with. It's just, those problems only come after there's a certain amount of uptake in the platform. And so hopefully we don't have to relearn all of these lessons as the next thing comes along, right? I'm hoping we can really do something cumulative here. And there is a lot more to be done. A lot of these findings have been very problem focused rather than theory focused, and there's work to do there. We've also kind of dehumanized the people who pretend to be robots, and it's nice that MTurk's really forced the conversation about what fair wages are and how we should be treating other people. This is something that qualitative types in the audience probably aren't sensitive to, but certainly the quantitative researchers, for them, MTurk workers are just data points. And so, this leads to issues of like low pay, but it also leads to just treating people like, kind of being a jerk, like not really giving people accurate time estimates, not paying them on time, not being very flexible, expecting that they complete screeners for free. And I think all of this is changing as we become aware that workers. And yeah, there's just lots of opportunities on the platform to do cool stuff that are being supported by new technologies, new platforms that can take advantage of the large number of subjects. And that's really great, and I'm excited to see it. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. I think we have about 10 minutes or something, 5 minutes. If anybody has any questions, and certainly during the social hour later today, we can talk a little bit more if you want to pick up anything on anything we talked about today.
And just maybe I'll just ask the first question. And thank you. That was a really amazing, comprehensive, and insightful overview. What do you think are some of the next interesting research questions that people should be looking at on Mechanical Turk?
So I think I think the space that I'm most interested in now, I think, is in some senses more qualitative work. I think a lot of the work that at least I've done approaching data quality or problems or seen people approach data quality starts off with a kind of preconceived notion about what the problem is, and then immediately leaps into collecting quantitative data to prove or not prove that that's true. And I just think that there maybe haven't been like enough sort of discussions with workers, like open-ended discussions or like observations of what they're doing to kind of get a handle on like what's actually going on. And I think that that is unfortunate because that can be really generative of new research topics, right? Like it can help surface problems that people aren't necessarily aware of. I know some of the ideas that I've had have definitely come from just looking at what other researchers are doing on the platform, which is, again, sort of qualitative, but yeah, I think the worker voice is really missing, and I'm excited to see some of that changing, right? So there was a big debate around the cognitive reflection task, which is this measure of ability, and whether people learn over time what the correct answers for those questions are. Lots of people showing data that they do improve over time, lots of people that they don't. And then this year, someone, and her name escapes me at the moment, I'll try and find it later today, basically just did cognitive interviews with workers answering those questions and had them think out loud while they're solving the problems. And when you listen to them talk through the problems, it becomes very clear that yes, in fact, they know the answer because they've seen it before, because they say things like, oh yeah, I remember this because I saw it yesterday, right? Like, really rich, really insightful. Turns out that wasn't necessary to solve through data collection, like quantitative data collection. And I think there's other problems like that and opportunities. So I'm hopeful. I've seen a lot of qualitative folks on the program today, and I'm glad they're here to tell us what to do next.
Yeah, and people can feel free to put questions in the chat or to raise your hand, and we can unmute microphones so that you can ask out loud. We do actually have a question in the chat. I think it's going back to the point you made about the lack of older adults on the platform. So Mark asks, is it really about being tech savvy at this point, or is it more about people deciding to do other things with their time, opportunity costs sort of issue coming up?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think we know. I mean, if it was about ROI, then you wouldn't expect that it would be the most educated, that it wouldn't necessarily. If it was about ROI and people having better things to do with their time, you would expect that it would not be, I think, older people who are higher in cognitive ability, more likely to be working. Like, you'd think that they would be off doing whatever it is they're doing, earning their peak earning potential. rather than being on the platform. That said, it's an open question. I do think that like one of the distinctions I would like to make is the difference between being online versus being extremely online. So internet penetration has definitely increased. You know, pretty much everybody's on the internet now, but you know, there's definitely corners of the internet that are more internet than elsewhere, right? So if you look at how like, you know, my parents use the internet, like they're definitely online, but they use, you know, they use the internet in a very different way. I don't think they've ever been on Reddit. I don't think they would have ever, I don't think they've ever even heard of Mechanical Turk, even though I research it, right? Like it's just different. But yeah, there's work to be done there. That's another space where you could look at qualitative findings, and I think learn something interesting about those older people who choose to be online.
Okay, I think we're right right around the time when we wanted to finish here. It's getting close to 11:15, and I think we're going to have a break now, a lunch break for an hour, and then after that, we're going to have more sessions. And so, thank you again, Jesse. This was really amazing, really great. And thank you, everybody. And I hope to see you shortly at the next sessions.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody's time and attention.
Awesome.